This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 572, entitled Masculists will test women. If they fail, they may end up voteless. Description. In a decade or so, masculism will probably be as influential as feminism. If the large majority of men become convinced that women are hardwired to be unempathetic towards men's suffering at the hands of women's massive gender crimes against men, in brackets, for example, man's slavery, divorce, rape, forced fathering, etc., then masculisted men may become so bitter and hateful at women for this that men decide to collectively punish women for being childishly irresponsible and then strip them of the right to vote. Not all women, but those who prove themselves to be unvoteworthy. For example, fluffies, fluffy feminists, deeply misandrist feminazis, etc. If men decide to disenfranchise women, there is nothing women could do about it, since women did not evolve to be warriors, whereas men did, thanks to women's sexual selection of warrior, toxic, conquering men, who thus gave women greater resources and hence increased women's survivability. Flyer itself. Masculists will test women. If they fail, they may end up voteless. By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Lately, I've been increasingly concerned and worried about how women are going to cope with masculism. That is, when masculine ideas are as prevalent and as influential as feminist ideas. Will women be almost universally hostile and really fight against the reforms and law changes that the masculists are pushing for? At a deeper level, I'm worried that it might be possible that women are simply genetically incapable of empathizing with men's suffering at the hands of women's many and decades-lasting gender crimes against men. For example, the big three of manslavery, divorce, rape, and forced fatherhood. I tell myself that there are some women who are already female masculists, since there are some prominent female authors who write about the afflictions of the traditional male role of being a man's slave to a woman, working for her for decades of his life. So I know that it is possible for some women to be female masculists, but my big question mark is just how large or small will that proportion of women be who label themselves female masculists? If it's really small, and the large majority of men become convinced that women, on the whole, are genetically incapable of empathizing with men in their suffering at the hands of women's massive gender crimes against men, then I envisage a massive backlash by men who, in real anger, bitterness, and hatred of women who are incapable, will then be strongly motivated to punish women, most women, and badly. The most obvious way to punish women collectively and near universally is simply to take away women's right to vote. From my own experience with several women lately, I've seen with my own eyes that most of the women I have come in contact with recently give me the strong impression that they have no empathy with masculist arguments. When I explain to them how women oppress men far worse than vice versa, in brackets e.g. the big three mentioned above, they give me the impression that they are hardwired not to feel anything that could be labelled empathetic towards men and masculist ideas. If millions of men, the large majority of men, come to the same impression, then there will be dire consequences for women. A collective bitterness in men will then grow and grow, and that bitterness will then fester into a collective hatred of women by men, as men learn that women appear to have evolved to be unempathetic towards men when it comes to women fipping up, that is, making the effort to fip up. And if they don't, then they will be seen by masculists as manslaving, divorce-raping vermin and hated. If most men become convinced that these women, who do not feel a strong moral obligation to fip up, so as not to parasite off and to manslave a man for decades of his life, should be punished for their criminal callousness towards men, and the question then arises, quote, just what form should that collective punishment against women, or certain categories of women, take? Question mark, end quote. One obvious answer that comes to mind is to strip women of the vote, or to strip fluffy, manslaving, divorce-raping women of the vote. This masculist threat could also serve the masculist cause and be used by the masculists once they are very strong in society, that is, when the large majority of men in society have been strongly influenced by masculist ideas, to enforce the masculist agenda. For example, in creating a FIP society, in which both sexes, especially girls, are socialised and educated to be FIPs, in men fairing the gender laws, reforming the divorce courts, putting powerful moral pressure on women to fip up or rot on the shelf, spat at by masculisted men. Thus, the masculist vision of disenfranchising women may not only be seen as a worry for masculists and of course for women, but it could also prove to be a very powerful ideological tool for the masculists. Masculists can say to women, quote, learn masculist ideas, understand that gender oppression is a two-way street, that women oppress men far worse, since many of women's gender crimes against men last decades, making them a lot more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women. Empathise with men who suffer greatly at the hands of fluffy women, fluffy feminists, who commit massive gender crimes against men. Do all this or lose your right to vote. Do this or be treated and seen by men as irresponsible children. And since children don't vote, you won't vote. End quote. I realise that it's early days, since masculism has not yet spread sufficiently for women to be tested, that is, judged by masculists, on how empathetic women are to masculist demands on women to fip up, to vote with men for the men fairing of the gender laws, to agree to giving up women's privileges in the divorce courts, to bother to get a career competent education, to become bi-conscious. In about a decade, masculists should have a pretty good idea of the proportion of women who are seen by masculists as vote-worthy, that is, considered adult enough, responsible enough to have fipped up, to have become bi-conscious, to have become female masculists, who empathise with men regarding the harm that women's gender crimes inflict on men, etc. Those women who fail to do this, that is, who fail the masculist test, in brackets, that is, the empathising test, the bi-consciousness test, the men-fairing test, etc., close brackets, may end up being stripped of their right to vote by men, by masculists, who collectively may see fluffy, manslaving, divorce-raping women as vermin, as children, as unvoteworthy, and strip them of their right to vote, arguing that, quote, children don't vote. Just how likely is the disenfranchisement of women in the next decade or so? At the present time, 2022, it's difficult to say, since nearly all women know almost nothing about masculism, so have not yet been exposed to masculist arguments, so are unable to react to them, empathetically or not empathetically. But in a decade or so, nearly all women will have been well exposed to masculist ideas, since masculism will be as influential as feminism, and no thinking, intelligent woman will be uninfluenced by the very strong masculist arguments. In brackets, for example, that it was men who liberated women from household drudgery, giving women a life expectancy of 85 years, and hence a career window of half a century. In brackets, even for those women who stay at home for a few years to raise small children, close brackets. So women have a powerful moral duty to fip up and not parasite off the money and labour of a man, thus not manslaving him, not divorce raping him, etc. Close brackets. The masculist community, in its millions, will then be able to judge whether women are hardwired to be non-empathetic towards men when it comes to women's gender criminality towards men. It's easy to argue that women are hardwired to be this way, since in the distant past, a woman needed to be able to quickly, coldly, callously, disloyally dump a man overnight and offer her cunt to a more sexploitable man if her current man lost his ability to provide male hunted meat to his woman and their kids. She had to evolve to be able to be like this, since her very survival and that of her kids depended on her being able to do this. Similarly, if her tribe was conquered and the men of her tribe were all killed, then she had to be able to offer her cunt to an enemy man and have kids by him. She had to be able to do this, or she herself would be killed, and hence her genes would be removed from the gene pool. Thus, evolutionary psychology provides easy arguments to suggest that women are unempathetic towards men's suffering at the hands of women's massive gender crimes against men. On the other hand, smart women cannot but be persuaded by the strength of masculist arguments for the fipping of women, for the creation of a fip society, for the men-fairing of the gender laws, etc. Just what the proportion of empathetic and non-empathetic women will be is still an open question. Let us say that a substantial proportion of women prove to be unempathetic. Then the above masculist rise in bitterness and hatred towards them still holds. I envisage then a mass masculist movement to collectively punish such women by stripping them of the right to vote. What form might this take? This will need to be strongly debated, but off the top of my head, I imagine that the vote will be denied to fluffies, to fluffy feminists, to monoconscious feminists, etc. How could this disenfranchisement of certain categories of women be initiated? By men taking a referendum amongst themselves. Then if the majority are in favour of disenfranchisement of certain categories of women, then new laws will be made to stop certain categories of women from voting. There won't be much that the disenfranchised women can do, since they can't go to war with men, since women did not evolve to be warriors, whereas men did, and were sexually selected by women to be just that. Fiercer men were better conquerors, who thus provided more resources to their women, who then survived with greater frequency. If men become collectively angry and hateful at women and decide on disenfranchisement, then there is nothing that women can do. I know from my own experience how bitterly I feel towards some of the women of my recent acquaintance who have shown no empathy towards men's suffering at the hands of women's gender crimes against men. I suspect that the proportion of female masculists who do empathise with men may be the minority, in which case, and time will tell, probably only a decade or so away, then the time will come for men to decide what to do with the unempathizing majority. Disenfranchise them? Question mark. Push their genes out of the gene pool by effectively exterminating them, by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them? Whatever the punishment, it will be harsh, coming from the majority of men who will develop a bitterness and hatred of misandrist women and punish them deeply, treating them either as children who are voteless or by just wiping them out slowly, by forcing them to rot on the shelf, dying a slow, miserable, manless, childless death. Take today's monoconscious, misandrist feminazis need to be very careful, because the masculists are rising and will wreak their revenge on misandrist women who commit massive gender crimes against men. We men are smarter and a lot more aggressive than women. So if and when we decide to collectively punish women, then women will suffer greatly. Monoconscious feminists and fluffies, take note. It's very much in your self-interest to do so. So wise up and take the above masculist threat to heart. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's